The Fantastic Four are Marvel's first family, and one of the most important superhero teams in history. Without them, the whole genre wouldn't be what it is today, and Marvel as a publisher and as a studio wouldn't even exist. But sadly, these guys had some terrible adaptations, and Marvel even ended up canceling their comics, leaving us with no content from this group for 3 full years. But the Fantastic Four came back in 2025 to make history. Today we're gonna look at the rise, the fall, and the new rise of the Fantastic Four. It all started back in November 1961, when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created a superhero team that was totally different from anything else out there at the time. Comic book stores were full of stoic heroes and cold, emotionless sci-fi stories. But these two legends came up with a comic that mixed family drama with space exploration, something unheard of in the 60s. Reed, Sue, Johnny, and Ben had awesome powers like other Marvel characters, but they weren't perfect. In an interview with the Comics Journal, Stan Lee said they made the Fantastic Four argue and not get along on purpose because they thought readers at the time would connect with that. And they totally did. The comic was a huge hit right from the start, giving Lee and Kirby the chance to go wild with their creativity. There were trips to other dimensions and showdowns with cosmic beings like Galactus and Silver Surfer, with art that broke new ground. Also, unlike the Justice League or the Avengers, the Fantastic Four weren't just out to stop some crazy villain trying to destroy the world. They were exploring the universe and diving into the unknown. They were explorers first, superheroes second, and they always stayed a family.
We're a family here.
That mix worked so well that Stan and Kirby stayed on the regular series for 102 issues straight, setting the record for the longest uninterrupted run by a creative team on a single comic. That run made history, introducing Dr. Doom, who would go on to become Marvel's biggest villain. And since the comic was selling like crazy, Stan and Kirby used it to introduce other characters who would turn out to be huge for Marvel too, like the Watcher, Black Panther, and the Inhumans. The Fantastic Four played a major role in building Marvel's cosmic side, since the Kree and the Skrull also made their debut there. And since the comic was selling so well, Marvel didn't take long to start making adaptations. In 1967, the animation studio Hanna-Barbera made a Fantastic Four cartoon, bringing the comic book stories to Saturday morning cartoons. Today, the animation looks super old school, and the tone feels way too childish, but back then, it got a whole new generation into the Fantastic Four. The opening theme was awesome, and the show worked as a promo for the comics, getting more people to read Stan and Kirby's adventures. And that was just the beginning. In the 70s, the group showed up on the radio, with a young Bill Murray voicing the Human Torch. The merch sold really well, and it looked like Marvel's first family had hit the big time. They were full-on pop culture icons. They even got a second animated series, which didn't go over as well as the first one because it had a super low budget. To make things worse, they didn't even use all the original team members. Because of a rights issue, they had to replace Johnny with a little robot named Herbie, who later showed up in the comics the next year. Still, the Fantastic Four were the biggest superhero team in the world, but not everything was fantastic.
Say that again.
In 1970, Kirby left Marvel because he felt like he wasn't getting the credit he deserved for his work. He wasn't just drawing. Thanks to the Marvel method, he was basically coming up with the whole story, even though he was only getting paid for the art. That's why a lot of fans believe he was the real creator of the Fantastic Four, and that Stan was just in charge of the marketing. But none of that can be confirmed, since both authors had different versions of what happened. What really matters is that Kirby leaving had a huge impact on the comic, and his absence was super noticeable in the following issues. Stan also left the title not long after to focus on other comics. And for almost a decade, the Fantastic Four just drifted along with different creative teams that couldn't bring back the magic from the 60s. It felt like the group just couldn't shine without Kirby's imagination, and Marvel's first family hit their lowest point in popularity since they first showed up. Until writer John Byrne came in and completely changed the Fantastic Four forever. He brought back the key ideas Lee and Kirby had introduced, keeping the team as explorers of the unknown, but he updated them to connect with a new audience. Byrne gave more backstory to Galactus and Silver Surfer, dove deeper into Ben's identity crisis, and reinvented Sue Storm. Up to that point, Sue was known as just the Invisible Girl, and had more of a sidekick role, like an assistant to the others instead of being a full-on hero.
I'm just an assistant.
Byrne changed her name, turning her into the Invisible Woman, so she'd be on the same level as the rest of the team. He made her the heart of the group, and the one who held everyone together. Her personality really stood out compared to Reed's. He might have been the smartest guy in the world, but he was pretty awkward when it came to dealing with people. Byrne also dove into her powers, showing that Sue could be one of the most powerful and interesting women in all of Marvel Comics. And that's not all. Byrne went for a bold move in issue 265, swapping out Ben for She-Hulk. Turns out, during the events of Secret Wars, Ben figured out how to turn back into his human form at will, and that made him question everything about his life. While on a self-discovery journey, he decided to leave the Fantastic Four and went off to have his own solo adventures in his own comic series. So the team wouldn't be left without muscle, Baron brought She-Hulk into the mix, taking advantage of the fact that she had become pretty popular thanks to her appearances in the Avengers comics. Ben came back 10 issues later, but the comic's success while he was gone made Marvel start thinking, should the Fantastic Four always be the same team, or could the members switch around, like what usually happened with the X-Men or the Avengers? From that point on, the editors didn't rule out the idea of swapping out a member if they ever needed to freshen up the team. But of course, the founding members are still the fan favorites. Byrne also gave more spotlight to Franklin Richards, Reed and Sue's son. He had already shown up back in the 60s, but this was the first time he was really given a personality, and he explored his powers, which could literally reshape reality.
I have all the power in the world!
This comeback worked so well that the Fantastic Four were back in the spotlight, quickly becoming one of Marvel's best-selling comics. And since they were big again, they had to show up in live action. In the mid-80s, producer Bernd Eichinger got the rights to make a Fantastic Four live-action movie, but he couldn't get the funding he needed to make a big blockbuster that would do justice to the comics. He was in a very tight spot, because if he didn't make a live-action film soon, Marvel would get the rights back, and all his investment would have been for nothing. So in 1993, Eichinger hired director Roger Corman to make one of the worst superhero movies ever. With only $1 million budget, the film they ended up with was honestly embarrassing. The costumes looked worse than cosplay, the dialogue was cheesy, the story made no sense, and the effects were worse than a bad adult parody. The movie was so awful, it made The Quest for Peace look like The Godfather in comparison. But Eichinger didn't really care about quality. The movie never got an official release, because according to Stan Lee, the studio never actually planned for anyone to see it. This movie existed only to make sure Marvel couldn't get the rights back, a move that Sony would end up copying years later to hang on to Spider-Man. But that's a story for another day.
Can't wait to hear it.
What matters now is that Eichinger's plan worked. He managed to keep the rights and made a deal with Fox to make a real movie with a big budget and famous actors. Chris Columbus, the director of Home Alone, was supposed to take charge of the film, but the production ran into a ton of issues. In the late 90s, it was almost impossible to show Reed and Johnny's powers without making people laugh. And to make things worse, Schumacher's Batman had trashed the reputation of superheroes in movies. The Fox execs were worried that a Fantastic Four movie with bad effects would turn into a meme fest, just like what happened with the latest Superman and Batman movies, so they decided to hold off. Columbus left the project to go make the Harry Potter movies, and the live-action Fantastic Four film was shelved until 2001, when Peyton Reed came in with a wild idea. Instead of doing an origin story or a typical superhero flick, he wanted to set the movie in the 60s and show the team as famous superheroes, kind of like a comedy with a Hard Day's Night vibe. Reed worked on pre-production for a year, but the whole thing fell apart. Fox wanted to rush production to move up the release date and avoid losing the rights, which didn't sit well with the director. Plus, the studio was pushing for a classic origin story instead of backing Reed's out there pitch, so he walked away from the project. Years later, he reused some of those ideas for Ant-Man in the MCU, and Marvel also borrowed a few concepts from that script to introduce their own Fantastic Four more than 20 years later.
It's funny how things turn out, isn't it?
With all the cancellations, rumors, and flops, fans started losing hope that we'd ever get a good live-action Fantastic Four movie. Their appearances in other media were limited to a third animated series that wasn't great, and a beat-em-up game that came and went without making any noise. It felt like the team would never get back the popularity they had in the 60s and 80s, when they were true icons and everybody was talking about them. But luckily, they still had some great stories in the comics. In the early 2000s, Mark Waid and Mike Wieringo took charge of a new run. Just like in Byrne's run, they brought back ideas from the 60s, but gave them a fresh update for a new era. Waid focused more on Reed and Sue's relationship, turning them into one of the most interesting couples in Marvel. He gave a role to Valeria, their daughter, who had a pretty convoluted origin. He also explored the philosophical side of the Fantastic Four space adventures, and showed us a new side of Dr. Doom, as a black magic user. Victor had been connected to magic ever since his debut, but that side of him was always in the background. Lee and Kirby mainly used him as a science-based villain and Reed's intellectual rival. But in 1989, Roger Stern and Mike Mignola had Doom team up with Doctor Strange to save his mom's soul, which pushed him further into the magical side. 10 years later, Waid picked that storyline back up and turned Doom into both a tech-based and magic-based villain. We saw this in the arc Unthinkable, where Doom kidnapped Reed and Sue's kids and tortured them using magic. He made Franklin believe he was trapped in hell forever.
He's evil!
Just when it seemed like only comic book readers could still enjoy the Fantastic Four, superhero movies changed forever. After the release of Raimi's Spider-Man and Singer's X-Men in the early 2000s, Fox realized that the genre could be a massive hit, so they threw down a wild $100 million on a live-action movie that actually made it to theaters. They hired director Tim Story to tell a classic origin story and stuck to some of the comic book concepts. They kept the family dynamic from Stan Lee and Kirby, introduced the team as famous superheroes, and did a solid job adapting their powers. Nowadays, reed stretching might not look all that great, but back in 2005, that was the best they could do, so people didn't walk out of the theater freaked out. The worst part was how they changed Doctor Doom's origin and his powers, and that the Thing looked more like he was made of rubber than rock. And sure, I know the critics tore it apart and comic book fans weren't totally happy with it, because it was far from the best possible Fantastic Four adaptation. But Chris Evans absolutely killed it as the Human Torch. Ben's character arc was handled really well, and overall it was a fun movie you could enjoy without feeling like your intelligence was being insulted. Michael Chiklis, who played Ben Grimm, defended the movie's light, slightly corny, and fun tone, saying the Fantastic Four shouldn't be dark and brooding. They didn't need to be like the Dark Knight, and he wasn't wrong. That vibe helped the movie work well with kids and casual audiences. And more importantly, it got a ton of people to pay attention to the team again, something that hadn't really happened since the 80s.
A new day is done. The day of the Fantastic Four.
Unfortunately for Fox, the movie didn't turn into a classic like Raimi's Spider-Man, and it didn't reshape the genre for years like Singer's X-Men, but it made $333 million, enough for the studio to greenlight a sequel and keep squeezing the franchise. The group's popularity shot up so much that the movie even got a video game that same year, and Studio Moonscoop put out an animated series with clear Japanese influences. Everything was set for the Fantastic Four to take over the world again and win everybody's hearts. Tim Story came back to direct the sequel to the live-action movie. This time, they plan to adapt the arrival of Galactus on Earth, one of the most iconic arcs in Fantastic Four history. Hype was pretty high, since superhero movies were having their best moments since Reeves' Superman, and the trailers looked solid. Silver Surfer looked perfect, like he was ripped straight out of a Kirby drawing. He blew everyone away in 2007, and even now, he still looks amazing. The studio had so much faith in the character, they started working on a Silver Surfer spin-off even before the movie came out. But the story didn't land so well. Good old Tim tried to show the group struggling to balance their personal lives with their superhero duties, something Sam Raimi had nailed in Spider-Man 2. But here, the Fantastic Four came off like a bunch of whiny divas, especially the Invisible Woman, who seemed more worried about her wedding than saving the world. The cheesy humor didn't really click with people because it felt a bit outdated. There wasn't much action for a superhero movie, and even though Silver Surfer was adapted pretty well, they turned Galactus into a cloud.
Look what they did to my boy! They massacred my boy!
Thinking people wouldn't buy into a big purple guy who eats planets for breakfast, Fox went all in on the realism button and ended up giving us one of the worst comic book adaptations ever made. A lot of fans walked out of the theater fuming, because this time they really felt insulted, and casual audiences didn't react much better, which showed in the box office numbers. Rise of the Silver Surfer made $301 million, just $30 million less than the first movie, but with a bigger budget. It barely turned a profit thanks to the merch, but Fox execs got cold feet. A third movie that flopped could destroy the franchise completely. The only way to save the Fantastic Four was to make the third film an absolute banger. But it didn't help that some of the cast started speaking out about the messy production. Jessica Alba said she was only hired to look sexy and made it clear she'd only come back as Sue Storm if the character was treated differently. A third movie would have needed a new creative team to win back audiences, but Fox wasn't sold on that idea. Instead, they put all their time and energy into the X-Men franchise, which had a better reputation at the time, was making more money, and had actors the public liked more. So they scrapped Fantastic Four 3 and the Silver Surfer spin-off. By the late 2000s, superhero movies were on the rise, but the Fantastic Four seemed stuck in the shadows of the X-Men and the Avengers. With no more adaptations coming, the merch disappeared, and casual audiences forgot about them. Fans just had to hope some good writer would give them a solid story in the comics, or settle for cameos in other shows like Superhero Squad or Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. For the second time, hopes of the Fantastic Four being mainstream just faded away. But the team still had tons of potential. In 2009, Jonathan Hickman completely shook up the Fantastic Four comics with a bunch of wild ideas. He introduced the Incursions, a concept that would later become key to the MCU's multiverse saga. He also came up with the Council of Reeds, a group made up of different variants of Reed Richards, some of them even wielding Infinity Gauntlets. In this run, we also saw the birth of the Future Foundation, a think tank of brilliant young minds led by Reed and Sue. Hickman explored Franklin's powers too, showing Galactus as his herald, and he gave Johnny some serious serious character growth, having him mature and even sacrifice himself for the team in one of the most emotional Fantastic Four stories ever. Hickman went bold in 2011 by reinventing the team, changing up their suits, and bringing in Spider-Man to replace the Human Torch. Meanwhile, Brian Michael Bendis turned an alternate universe version of Reed Richards into the villain known as the Maker. The twist was so good that the character showed up in tons of stories, and even got brought into Earth 616 as a recurring Avengers villain. Fantastic Four comics were still full of fresh, exciting ideas that fans loved, but no one had the drive or the vision to bring them back into the mainstream outside of the comics.
That's a shame.
Until 2012, when Fox had no choice but to make a new live-action movie, because they were in the exact same spot Eichinger had been in back in the 90s. If they didn't make a film, Marvel would get the rights back, and they couldn't let that happen. So they announced a reboot directed by Josh Trank, who had just directed the indie thriller Chronicle that same year. With only $12 million, Trank had told a grounded, realistic superhero story that was a hit both with critics and at the box office. Fox saw him as the perfect guy to make a dark, gritty, realistic version of the Fantastic Four that would be totally different from the 2000s films. They wanted to replicate the success of Nolan's Batman. The idea was weird because the Fantastic Four had always been known for being fun, colorful, optimistic, and all about exploring mind-blowing concepts. But Trank's version was going to be dark, depressing, and with elements of body horror. The justification was that one of Stan Lee's original ideas was for the team to suffer when using their powers, since all of them had physical transformations. That idea was dropped back in the day, but Trank thought it was interesting and could make the group stand out from all the other superheroes in theaters at the time. They brought in a cast of young, promising actors like Miles Teller and Michael B. Jordan, and pulled inspiration from the Ultimate Universe, an alternate Marvel universe where all the stories were told from scratch with a more modern tone. Funny enough, the Maker came from that universe, which got fans speculating that maybe Teller's Reed Richards could turn into the Maker and cross over with the Avengers down the line. But before the movie even came out, things were already looking pretty bad. Trank had a lot of clashes with the studio during production. There were reshoots that changed half the story, and he wasn't even allowed into the editing room. One day before the movie hit theaters, the director tweeted that he had a fantastic version of the film, but that the world would never see it, basically disowning the movie. It was kind of like what happened with Zack Snyder and Justice League 2 years later, except Trank never got to release his director's cut of Fantastic Four. As everyone except the Fox execs could have guessed, Fan4stick was a complete disaster. The movie was a total Frankenstein, full of super obvious reshoots, weak effects, actors with zero chemistry, and almost no action for a superhero film. The body horror bits felt out of place, the characters barely used their powers, they didn't feel like a family at all, and Dr. Doom's origin was embarrassing. On top of all that, it wasn't even one of those so bad it's funny movies, like Batman Forever. It was just really, really boring, and felt like a total waste of time. Since people aren't stupid, this train wreck flopped hard at the box office. It only made $167 million in a post-Avengers world where even second-string heroes like Ant-Man were pulling in $500 million. But the worst part was that nobody liked it. It got the worst Rotten Tomatoes score of any Fantastic Four movie ever, even lower than the 90s version. Fans ripped it apart harder than any other superhero movie. Casual audiences didn't even bother going to the theater because of its bad rep. And Fox ended up doing exactly what they were trying to avoid back in 2007. They turned the franchise into a meme.
Gotta say, it's fantastic.
Hilarious.
Everyone involved tried to distance themselves from the project, but it was already too late. Miles Teller said you can't make a good movie with a bad script, hinting that the whole idea was doomed from the start. Toby Kebbell, who played Dr. Doom, said Trank had a great vision, but the studio changed everything in post-production. And Simon Kinberg, producer of the X-Men movie saga, admitted that the movie's tone went against what the Fantastic Four are all about, so of course people weren't gonna like it. They did the exact opposite of what Michael Chiklis had said back in the 2000s. This flop had brutal consequences for the team. Fox lost money and had to scrap any plans to build a franchise out of this reboot. A lot of fans started to think it was just impossible to get a good adaptation of the Fantastic Four after 3 failed attempts, and casual audiences started thinking the team was just a joke and that the real Marvel heroes were Spider-Man, the X-Men, and the Avengers. With the group turned into a meme, Marvel ended up canceling the Fantastic Four comics after 50 years of uninterrupted publication. The last time we saw them together was at the end of the Second Secret Wars by Jonathan Hickman, where Reed and Doom had one final battle over the fate of the multiverse. After that, Reed, Sue, and their kids disappeared from Universe 616. Marvel said the cancellation was due to poor sales, which wasn't a total lie, since the comic wasn't even cracking the top 20 monthly bestsellers. But a lot of fans suspected the real reason was they didn't want to promote characters owned by Fox, and they wanted to avoid the stink of Fan4stick rubbing off on the comics they were trying to sell.
I understand the business reasons.
In 2017, Hickman confirmed that Marvel had stopped publishing those comics because of their issues with Fox, which made fans even angrier. Now we couldn't even enjoy the team in the comics anymore because Marvel had just wiped them off the map. They didn't even show up under a different name. They were put on indefinite pause, waiting for Fox to finally give up and hand the rights back to Marvel so they could bring the Fantastic Four into the MCU. But Fox had no intention of letting go because they still saw money-making potential in future Fantastic Four adaptations. So for 3 years, the team hit rock bottom. They vanished from comics, animated shows, video games, and movies. The once celebrated pioneers of the Marvel Universe had vanished, buried under corporate drama and one flop after another. All we got was Ben showing up with the Guardians, and Johnny tagging along with Spider-Man and the Inhumans. But things turned around in 2018. By then, people had finally moved past the bad taste of Fan 4-stick. Plus, Disney had bought Fox, meaning Marvel automatically got the rights to the X-Men and the Fantastic Four back. Dan Slott, who had worked on Spider-Man comics for years, was chosen to relaunch the team with a new issue simply called Fantastic Four #1. This version wasn't as cosmic or mind-bending as Hickman's, but it focused on classic adventure and family bonding. It brought back the original lineup and the classic suits. Slott's run kicked off with the team reuniting after being scattered across the multiverse, leaning hard into nostalgia, while still introducing new cosmic threats and giving Franklin and Valeria bigger roles in the story. That first issue was a hit. It became the 5th best-selling comic the month it dropped. They weren't as popular as they'd been in the 60s or 80s, but people were clearly ready to see more of the Fantastic Four, and it was only a matter of time before they made their way into the MCU.
Could I be any more turned on?
The first tease came at San Diego Comic-Con in 2019, when Kevin Feige mentioned that the new lineup after the Infinity Saga would include some newly acquired characters. Feige promised to bring Marvel's first family up to the level and spotlight they deserved, but didn't share any details about how or when we'd see the Fantastic Four in action. The first official announcement came a year later, in December 2020. Marvel dropped the first logo and revealed that John Watts, the director of the MCU's Spider-Man movies, would be handling the reboot. But at that point, there was still no cast or plot info. We didn't even know how they'd explain the Fantastic Four's absence during the Infinity Saga. Of course, there were all kinds of fan theories. Maybe time travel, parallel universes, or even the idea that the team had been blipped by Thanos at the end of Infinity War and got their powers when they came back after Iron Man's snap. Since Marvel wasn't giving out any info, fans started speculating that the team could pop up in any MCU project. In episode 5 of WandaVision, Monica Rambeau mentioned an aerospace engineer, and everyone immediately thought she was talking about Reed Richards. The hype got so out of control that director Matt Shakman had to step in and clarify that he wasn't planning to include any Fantastic Four cameos, just so fans wouldn't end up disappointed. Funny thing is, Shakman actually did get to introduce the group in live action, just not in WandaVision. In 2022, Reed Richards finally showed up in the MCU in Doctor Strange 2, but as a variant from Universe 838 and a member of the Illuminati. Marvel cast John Krasinski for the role, which fans absolutely loved, since he'd been one of the most popular fan casts for years. Some comic artists had even started drawing Reed with Krasinski's face. It felt like the perfect way to introduce the Fantastic Four, but he got killed off by Wanda after just a couple lines of dialogue.
Disappointed!
This cameo was very controversial. Not everyone was happy with the overdesigned suit, or with the choice to kill off the character so quickly. Krasinski later explained that Feige called him just to do a fun cameo to please the fans, and that there were no plans for him to play the main universe's Reed Richards. It was a good idea on paper, but fans ended up disappointed, feeling like Marvel had wasted Krasinski. A lot of people started to worry that maybe Feige wouldn't know how to handle the Fantastic Four after such a weak and pointless death. Plus, back then, John Watts didn't have the best rep, since a lot of people were mad about Peter Parker's characterization in Far From Home. Sure, by the end of No Way Home, he did feel more like the classic Spider-Man, but nobody wanted to wait through 3 movies just to finally see the Fantastic Four actually respect the comic book characters. Luckily, in September 2022, Watts stepped away from the project and Shakman took over as director. But they made us wait all the way until February 2024 to hear anything about the movie. They announced a cast packed with star power. Pedro Pascal as Reed, Vanessa Kirby as Sue, Joseph Quinn as Johnny, and Eben Moss-Bachrach as Ben. There was a bit of drama around casting Pascal, since it was hard to deny that Krasinski looked more like the comic book version of the character. But the first artwork they dropped on Valentine's Day was already packed with hints that had fans freaking out. For example, a 1963 Life magazine cover showed up in the poster, and Pascal made a fun little nod to 60s Beatles songs, which instantly got people guessing that the movie might take place in the 60s. They also revealed that the Fantastic Four's robot sidekick, Herbie, was going to be in the movie as a tribute to the '78 TV show. On April 4th, Marvel dropped the second official artwork, showing the Human Torch skywriting the Fantastic Four logo in flames. In the background, you could spot some retro-futuristic buildings, adding fuel to the theories that the movie will take place in a different universe, separate from the MCU.
Looks like I'm gonna have to squint.
By mid-April, Marvel had officially cast Julia Garner as Silver Surfer, confirming they were going with Shalabal, the female version of the Surfer from Earth X. This was the most controversial decision around the whole movie, since a lot of fans felt there was no need to ditch Norrin Radd. But the outrage didn't last long, because right after that, they announced Ralph Ineson would be playing Galactus. So Marvel was planning to adapt Galactus' first comic appearance again, but this time, keeping the original design of the Devourer instead of turning him into a cloud. To keep the hype going, Marvel threw in a second multiverse cameo of the Fantastic Four, this time in Deadpool and Wolverine. They included Chris Evans' Human Torch, who was stuck in the void. It was a much more fun and fitting cameo than Krasinski's. Of course, this Johnny variant ended up getting killed by Cassandra in a brutal way, but the tone of the movie made his death work, and people were cool with it. It made sense for a member of the team to show up, since Deadpool and Wolverine acted as a send-off for the Fox universe. At that point, we still didn't know that Singer's X-Men would be showing up in Doomsday, so it felt like the final goodbye to that era of superhero movies. But we still had no clue how they were going to handle the Fantastic Four in the MCU. Luckily, just a week after Deadpool and Wolverine came out, Marvel gave the Fantastic Four their own full panel at San Diego Comic-Con. They revealed the full title of the movie, showed an exclusive teaser with the first look at Galactus, and showed off a replica of the Fantastic Car. Shockman confirmed that the movie took place in another universe, but the real bombshell was the announcement that Robert Downey Jr. would be coming back as Dr. Doom.
Wow, fantastic.
Say that again?
That news broke the internet, sparked a ton of debate online, and got people way more hyped about the Fantastic Four. Even though Doom wouldn't be the main villain of the movie, everyone expected him to at least show up in a post-credit scene to tie into Avengers Doomsday. The hype kept growing in January 2025, when the Fantastic Four joined Marvel Rivals, one of the most successful superhero games in recent years. Introduced in Season 1, the team helped fight off Dracula's eternal night in a multiverse version of New York, using science to fight back against dark magic. People went nuts the moment they saw them, because each character's gameplay stayed true to the comics. The suits looked awesome, the team-up moves were super creative, and it was great to finally see a solid adaptation of the Fantastic Four. Their appearances, along with Emma Frost's curves, were the most talked about parts of the game, proving that the Fantastic Four could be mainstream again. The group had already taken over comics thanks to Dan Slott and Ryan North. They'd taken over video games with Marvel Rivals. And now, all they had left to conquer was the big screen, something they hadn't managed to pull off in over 60 years of history. In February 2025, Marvel dropped the first teaser for the new movie, and it was super well received. People loved the retro-futuristic look, which was nailed thanks to a mix of practical effects and solid post-production work. The suits looked even better than the ones in Marvel Rivals. The Thing's effects were top-notch, and the teaser ended with a promise of a comic-accurate Galactus. Fans liked it so much that the teaser hit 202 million views in its first 24 hours, making it the third most viewed Marvel trailer ever, only behind Deadpool and Wolverine and No Way Home.
Incredible.
Since they knew this movie had to perform well no matter what, Marvel went all in on marketing. First, they took a few notes from Deadpool and Wolverine. AMC Theaters rolled out a limited edition Galactus popcorn bucket that was actually huge. And second, they released a prequel comic written by Matt Fraction. It was framed as an in-universe publication by the Future Foundation and told the story of the Fantastic Four's early heroic adventures, celebrating their 4th anniversary. Marvel went from canceling Fantastic Four comics to sabotage the old Fox movies, to publishing comics to help promote the new movies. With people excited again for superhero movies thanks to James Gunn's Superman, first steps finally hit theaters to give the Fantastic Four the adaptation they always deserved. And the movie didn't disappoint. We already knew the aesthetic would be spot on, but Shockman also made the team feel like a real family. He gave Johnny more depth beyond just being the pretty face, explored Sue's powers and her role as both a mom and a political figure, nailed the adaptation of Galactus, and showed us the Fantastic Four as explorers and celebs, not just superheroes. People left the theater so happy that it became the highest rated Fantastic Four movie ever, both by fans and critics. It also pulled in $117 million during its domestic opening weekend, the best numbers in Fantastic Four history. It even set a new 2025 record for Thursday night previews, making $24.4 million, beating out Gunn's Superman. And it made more on its first day than Fan4stick did during its entire global run. Plus, Marvel brought in $170 million in media value from global brand partnerships and promos, the best numbers the franchise has ever seen.
I like money.
But not everything was sunshine and rainbows. First Steps had a 60% drop in its second weekend at the box office, one of the worst drops in the entire MCU. Still, since critics, fans, and casual viewers all liked it, Bob Iger, Disney's current CEO, said the Fantastic Four are key to Marvel's future. Disney execs are happy with how the movie was received, especially now that even your aunt and your cousin like the Fantastic Four. They'll probably make a sequel after Secret Wars comes out, because First Steps wasn't about hitting $1 billion. Its mission was to get people to like the Fantastic Four again after the mess Fox left behind, and it pulled it off. The big question now is whether they can pull off the same thing with Dr. Doom, who's never really been done justice in live action. I know casting Robert Downey Jr. was a bit controversial, but in this video, I'll explain why it was actually a genius move and how they can make it work.
Why don't you prove it?